Christina Castiglione, 19, lived with her mother and father in Redford. She graduated from Redford Union High School and was active in sports, the release said. She was not married but had a steady boyfriend. She was employed by the Detroit Edison Company as a clerk in the research department and had contacted an Army recruiter prior to her disappearance. On March 21, 1983, Christina Castiglione was reported missing by her mother in Redford Township. On March 29, 1983, the Livingston County Sheriff's Office was alerted to a deceased body located in the Oak Grove State Game Area on Fawcett Road in Deerfield Township. Deputies responded and found the body of Christina Castiglione partially clothed and lying in a remote wooded area. Detectives found evidence that Christina had been strangled to death and sexually assaulted. During the autopsy, the medical examiner located male DNA sources that were collected and preserved. Lacking DNA technology in 1983, these samples were later entered into CODIS by the Michigan State Police Crime Lab in the early 2000s, but a suspect was never identified. For nearly 40 years, the Livingston County Cold Case team and detectives worked extensively on the case and pursued an exhaustive number of potential leads. In March of 2022, the office applied for and received grant funding through Season of Justice to conduct advanced DNA testing on the suspect DNA samples taken in 1983. Season of Justice is a non-profit organization dedicated to funding DNA testing on unsolved cold case homicides. They provide funding to law enforcement agencies nationwide to conduct advanced testing in homicide, sexual assault, and Jane/John Doe cases where the victim's body or the suspect is unidentified, and DNA is the only investigative option. In May 2022, DNA evidence from the case was sent to Othram Incorporated, a private forensic laboratory in Texas. Othram scientists used forensic-grade genome sequencing to develop a comprehensive genealogical profile from the DNA of the unknown suspect, which returned leads to authorities. The investigation led to the identification of a suspect, Charles David Shaw. His identification was confirmed by 3 separate familial DNA comparison tests. Unfortunately, Shaw died in November of 1983 and will never be held responsible for his crime in a court of law. Detectives were unable to find any direct ties between Christina and Charles Shaw to suggest why she was targeted. However, through collaboration with living relatives of the killer, it was determined that he was a longtime Livonia resident who lived less than 5 miles from where Christina went missing. Based on information received from Shaw's family, he was described as a sex addict with a disturbing life who struggled with mental illness and his gender identity. Charles Shaw had several interactions with law enforcement beginning at a young age. One such interaction resulted in his arrest in 1981 for the attempted abduction of a woman in the Fowlerville McDonald's parking lot. The cooperation of the Shaw family during the investigation was paramount to identifying Charles Shaw as the person responsible for the homicide of Christina Castiglione. Sonia Carmen Stone, a single mother from Quebec, was strangled to death with her own pantyhose on October 15, 1981 in her Carmel home while her 4-year-old daughter was at school. She was a sales representative at Levi Strauss, had a broken left ring fingernail with blood beneath it, which suggested she scratched her attacker. DNA found underneath the young mom's broken fingernail has led to the conviction of a neighbor 40 years later. Michael Glazebrook, 67, was found guilty of first-degree murder with enhancements for using a deadly weapon and for committing rape in the death of 30-year-old Sonia Carmen Herrick Stone. The verdict comes 41 years after the former school bus driver was tried for the murder but not convicted after a jury was unable to reach a unanimous verdict. "It's been a day that we've been waiting for a really long time," Herrick Stone's daughter Sasha Stone said after the verdict, KSBW reported. The case was reopened in 2020. The renewed investigation included forensic testing unavailable at the time of the original trial, according to the Monterey County District Attorney's Office. The testimony was that her back door was unlocked, so we are presuming that is likely how he gained entry, Deputy District Attorney for Monterey County Matthew Leroux tells People. We didn't find any other signs of forced entry, and we don't think she would have let him in. Leroux says the attack happened right inside the front door. She still had her outer jacket and purse with her, he says. We think it was likely she was walking in the house when she was attacked. Glazebrook was 25 and married at the time and had recently moved into the home across the street just months earlier. He became a suspect immediately after a detective investigating the killing spotted a 3 to 4 inch vertical scratch down his right cheek. Initially, he said he was at his father's house, and then, in 2021 when he was interviewed, he said he was at school at the time of the murder, says Leroux. Glazebrook was taking college classes and worked as a carpenter at the time of the killing. Leroux says Herrick Stone and Glazebrook did not know each other. None of her friends or neighbors could say they knew each other, he says. During this month's trial, California Department of Justice criminalists testified that DNA evidence found underneath Herrick Stone's broken fingernail and her right breast linked Glazebrook to the crime. Leroux says in 1983 there was no DNA testing and all they could do was blood typing for genetic markers. I do think the DNA is what made the difference, he says. It was the strongest direct evidence we had linking him to the murder. The family just wanted to express our tremendous gratitude for this team, Stone said, according to KSBW. Sonia was a wonderful woman and we're so happy to see justice for her. Glazebrook is scheduled to be sentenced on April 26. In 1971, Rita Curran, a 24-year-old schoolteacher, was found strangled to death in her apartment in Vermont. The college town of Burlington, where Curran taught second grade, was devastated. Police interviewed Curran's neighbors, investigated hundreds of tips and collected evidence, including a single cigarette butt found near her arm, but were unable to name her killer. Curran's murder, unsolved for more than 5 decades, became one of Vermont's most notorious cold cases. That changed this week, when police detectives announced the identity of her murderer, a male neighbor, police say, who later became a Buddhist monk and countercultural guru before dying of an overdose in 1986. DNA technology and genealogical research have linked the cigarette butt found near Curran's body to William DeRoos, who lived upstairs in the same apartment block. Investigators interviewed DeRoos in the 1970s but ruled him out. Even though he's dead, and there won't be justice, it is a really positive outcome, C.C. Moore, a genealogical investigator at Virginia-based Parabon Nanolabs, said. Moore's research identified DeRoos. And it is a great illustration of how investigative genetic genealogy is resolving these cases that so many people have cared about for so many years. In the summer of 1971, Curran had recently moved into a shared apartment. She was working as a hotel maid and taking graduate courses at the University of Vermont while waiting for school to start. Around midnight on July 19, her housemates found her dead. She had been attacked, sexually assaulted and asphyxiated. DeRoos, who lived 2 floors above Curran with his then-wife, was not one of the investigation's 13 main suspects. His wife told police that they were home all night. Bundy, who was born in Burlington, was thought to have been in the area around the time Curran died. Shortly before his execution in 1989, however, he denied responsibility. Curran's death became known as Burlington's oldest cold case murder. In 2014, Burlington police decided to reprocess the evidence using modern technology. Male DNA was found on the cigarette found near Curran's body, but it did not match a national felon database or any of the 13 primary suspects. The Burlington police reopened the case, again, in 2019. Detectives sent the cigarette DNA to Parabon. It took Moore only a few hours to identify DeRoos. At the top of the list were two people who shared enough DNA with the unknown suspect to be his first cousin once removed, Moore said, and those matches ended up being on both sides of his family tree. That's extremely unusual. It was shocking. Testing of DNA on Curran's housecoat confirmed the findings. When police re-interviewed DeRoos' ex-wife, she admitted to deceiving detectives. She said DeRoos, who had a criminal history, had persuaded her that she had to protect him from false incrimination. The couple had married 2 weeks earlier. I think she lied at the time because she was young, she was naive, she was newly married, she was in love, Thomas Chanette, a Burlington detective, told the press on Tuesday. In actuality, she and DeRoos had argued that night. DeRoos left the apartment and returned while she was asleep. He and his wife left Vermont soon afterward. They separated, and DeRoos moved to Thailand to become a Buddhist monk. A few years later he surfaced in California, where he remarried and was known as a countercultural guru called Dutch. DeRoos' second wife, from whom he also became estranged, told police that he had a violent temper and had once choked her and non-fatally stabbed a friend. About 15 years after Curran's death, he died of a drug overdose in a San Francisco hotel room. I don't think so much about the guy who did this as I do about Rita and my parents and what they went through, Curran's brother, Tom Curran, recently told the press. In February 1973, Leslie Perloff was 21. She had graduated the previous year from Stanford and had been accepted to law school at the University of Pennsylvania. In the meantime, she was working in Santa Clara County's law library in Palo Alto. Leslie lived with her widowed mother, Florence Perloff, in Los Altos Hills, and had two younger siblings, 20-year-old Diane and 18-year-old Craig. Highly intelligent and ambitious, Leslie planned to become a lawyer. She had been offered a place at the University of Pennsylvania and would have started her degree in the fall of 1973. On February 13, 1973, a Tuesday, she was last seen alive as she left work for the day around 3 p.m. It is speculated that, as she often did, she stopped on the way home to take a walk in the hills west of Stanford's campus. She was missing for 3 days before her car was found parked off Old Page Mill Road. Her body was not far off the road, for she had been strangled, apparently with her own scarf. In March 1974, Janet Taylor was 21. She had grown up in the Stanford area as the daughter of Chuck Taylor, the university's football coach, 1951-57, and athletic director, 1963-71. A graduate of Menlo Atherton High School, she was living in La Honda with a friend, attending Canada College and working in an office on Page Mill Road. On March 24, 1974, a Sunday, the housemate dropped Taylor off at Stanford because her car wasn't working. She had dinner with friends at their home on Girona Road and left around 7 p.m., saying she intended to hitchhike home to La Honda, about 15 miles away. Her housemate was working that evening at the Miramar Beach Jazz Club Bach Dancing and Dynamite Society, and Taylor said someone needed to let their dogs out. The following morning, her body was found in a ditch 3 miles from Stanford University on Sand Hill Road and Manzanita Way by a milk truck driver. Like Leslie, Janet had been strangled. She had not been sexually assaulted, and was mostly clothed, aside from her raincoat, shoes and belt, which were later recovered by detectives discarded on Sand Hill Road. She had been carrying a purse, which was never found. Detectives were almost completely in the dark in this investigation. They believed there was a sexual motivation to the murder, even though Janet had not been sexually assaulted. Whoever had picked her up as she was hitchhiking had killed her, then discarded her belongings along Sand Hill Road as they drove away. Detectives had very few leads, and just as Leslie's case had, it was not long before Janet's also went cold. The public were convinced that Leslie and Janet were killed by the same person, even though detectives said there was no solid evidence to suggest this. Everything they had was circumstantial. The cases went cold until the arrest of serial killer Ted Bundy, who was known to target young women. But after investigating, detectives concluded they couldn't find any evidence Bundy killed Taylor and Perlov. Now, 45 years later, San Mateo County officials say their initial hunch has been confirmed. They've arrested one man for both slayings. On Thursday, May 16, 2019, San Mateo County authorities announced they believe John Arthur Getrew, of Hayward, California, based on the DNA of his relatives, already in custody since November 2018 on suspicion of killing Perlov, has also been arrested in connection with Taylor's murder. The San Mateo County Sheriff's Office reopened the cases in 2017 and submitted DNA evidence from the original crime scenes. Investigators say a match was found for Getrew, now 74, of Hayward. The Sheriff's Office says Getrew has a long history of violence against women. In 1964, when he was 18, Getrew was put on trial for a rape resulting in the death of a 16-year-old girl in Germany. He was convicted in 1975 of raping a Santa Clara County woman. Getrew pleaded not guilty to both murders. He was due to stand trial in September 2020 for Janet's murder, but was hospitalized with a brain aneurysm right before his trial was set to begin. In November 2021, 77-year-old John Getrew was sentenced to life in prison by San Mateo County Superior Court Judge Robert Foyles. He has been charged, but is yet to be tried for Leslie's murder. John pleaded guilty on Tuesday, January 10, 2023, to the 1973 murder of Leslie Marie Perlov, a 21-year-old law librarian on Stanford University land, the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office said. John is sentenced to life in prison. Perlov and Taylor were not Getrew's first victims. He was convicted in Germany of murdering and raping a 15-year-old girl, Margaret Williams, a decade before Perlov and Taylor were killed. He spent approximately 6 years of a 10-year sentence in a German prison for the crime. The fathers of Getrew and Williams were stationed at a military base at the time, and the two met at a dance. He lured her to a nearby field where the assault and killing took place, according to newspaper stories from that time. Getrew has also been convicted of raping a 17-year-old Palo Alto resident, Diane Doe, in 1975. On April 13, 1984, 23-year-old Terry Lynn Kirkland was found beaten and stabbed to death near a Knoxville, Tennessee park. Her case remains unsolved. After just 1 month of forming a new unit, the Knoxville Police Department solved a murder case from 1984, according to officials with the department. Terry Lynn Kirkland was found beaten and stabbed to death on April 13, 1984, when a child made a horrific discovery in a Knoxville park. A little girl was playing, she lived next to the park, explained investigator Jeff Day with the Knoxville Police Department. Buck Tom's Park wasn't a large space, mostly woods mixed with slides and other playground equipment. She was laying face down, partially clothed, stabbed multiple times. It was a very brutal, sadistic killing, said Day. There were some other things done to her. Whoever killed her was very mad, very angry. The 23-year-old's death spurred fear among neighbors living nearby. It's not something you forget, a murder, said Day. People in that area talked about it, were scared about it. It was in a public park and was a pretty brutal murder. At the time, investigators conducted interviews, collected evidence, but no answers ever came. There was a knife next to the body, the handle had been broken off, the blade and handle was broken and it had blood all over it, described Day. Today, that small city park is pretty much non-existent, covered by woods, and the case is now in the hands of Detective Jeff Day. There is a good suspect, can't tell you who, said Day. He believes Kirkland's killer was no stranger. "She was there with someone she knew. I would guarantee she knew them," said Day. The brutal nature of the crime leads him to suspect the close connection. "The more violent an act is, it's more personal to them," explained Day. "The person responsible, he believes, is likely alive today." The suspects in this case are in their 50s now, and I imagine at that time, they were 25 years old, said Day. Detective Day feels they are close to solving this murder. "It might not take much more, it's like a puzzle," he explained. "You need a certain number of pieces before you can prosecute a homicide case. The pieces are there, but some we still need. I can see why a witness might be scared, that's understandable. Maybe now they can come forward and feel safer now. Any tip we could get could prosecute this case. We are close." The Knoxville Police Department Investigations Bureau recently underwent several structural changes in an effort to improve the Bureau's collective response, effectiveness and efficiency, highlighted by the formation of the Homicide Unit. The newly formed Homicide Unit went into effect on February 26 and is responsible for investigating all homicides, suspicious deaths, suicides, non-fatal shootings with the victim and any assault in which the victim suffers potentially life-threatening injuries. Investigators with the new unit identified a suspect, who died in 2021. After the case findings were passed along to the District Attorney General's office, they determined there was enough evidence to prosecute the suspect and closed the case due to the death of the suspect. "I appreciate Deputy Chief Coker and Captain Morrow for their forward thinking and championing this initiative," KPD Chief Paul Noel. "With nearly 70% of our murder cases in 2023 effectively solved and the closure of a nearly 40-year-old unsolved case, the Homicide Unit has done an exceptional job of identifying suspects and working towards justice for victims and their families. Rest in peace to the victim, and hopefully that gives some sort of closure to the victim's family." It has been 20 years since 20-year-old SUNY Orange student Megan McDonald was murdered. McDonald, a 2000 graduate of Burke Catholic High School, was 20 years old when she left her job at American Cafe restaurant in the Galleria Mall in the town of Wallkill on March 13, 2003. She was with friends that night in Middletown, was seen twice outside a party in her old town of Wallkill neighborhood of Greenway Terrace, the last time at about midnight. Then she vanished. Her beaten body was found in a field off Bowser Road on March 15, 2003. That's the official date of her death, etched on her heart-shaped gravestone in the St. Joseph's Church Cemetery in Middletown. Her Mercury sable was found on March 17 at the Kensington Manor apartment complex. Police conducted dozens of interviews and followed more than 800 leads in the 20 years since her death. Their work filled entire file cabinet drawers in the Troop F barracks in Middletown. Dateline featured Megan's story in our Cold Case Spotlight series in 2022, speaking with Megan's family and New York State Police investigators who had recently begun to take a fresh look at the case. A detective at the time, Lieutenant Brad Natalizio, was one of the investigators whom Dateline interviewed. He provided an update to mark the 20-year anniversary, and sparked a media push. As a result of the media attention, officials have received many more leads. In a later interview, an initial witness had a new detail. New York State Police Detective Brad Natalizio told Dateline a vehicle with a loud sound system that had been seen behind McDonald's car. The witness only noticed it because the volume was so loud, according to the Dateline report. It was likely a dark car that looked like a Honda Civic hatchback. Her father spent 20 years with the NYPD and did some homicide detective work there but died of a heart attack in 2002, McDonald's sister, Karen, told Dateline. He was 47 and she told the show that watching him work over the years made her confident the investigators working on her sister's case wouldn't give up until it's solved. McDonald arrived at a home in Wallkill for a birthday party that night around 7 p.m., but she didn't go inside because a guy she knew named Edward Holly who owed McDonald money was there, and she tried to end their relationship several days before she was killed, the complaint said. About 30 minutes later, McDonald arrived at a house in Middletown and made multiple calls trying to find marijuana, including one call to a friend at the party where Holly was, the complaint said. Around midnight, McDonald left the party and said she was going straight home because she had to work the next day, the complaint said. At about 12:15 a.m., McDonald arrived back at the Wallkill birthday party and told people she was going to go smoke, and 2 minutes later she drove away, the complaint said. Around 12:25 a.m., McDonald arrived at suspect 2's house, and he got in her car and told McDonald he didn't have marijuana for her, the complaint said. McDonald then told him she'd go get marijuana from Holly, according to a 2010 interview with Suspect 2, the complaint said. Holly was McDonald's main marijuana supplier and police believe McDonald reached out to him as a last resort on the night she was killed, the complaint said. Around 12:30 a.m., a witness saw McDonald's car being followed through Wallkill by a dark Honda Civic hatchback, according to the complaint. Days later, when McDonald's car was found 500 feet from Holly's home, police determined the 20-year-old had been killed while she was in the driver's seat of her car, the document said. Holly later told police he knew McDonald was outside the house party where he was on the night she was killed, according to the complaint. In one interview, Holly told police he drove his purple Honda Civic hatchback back to his home that night, according to the complaint. Holly provided numerous contradictory stories and alibis, according to the complaint. Authorities said Holly consistently told police he last saw McDonald several days before she was killed when they had an altercation, though police said his reason for the altercation changed in each interview, according to the felony complaint. In 2021, an analysis showed McDonald's DNA and Holly's DNA on McDonald's phone, which was left in her car, the complaint said. Authorities believe the night of the murder Holly went through McDonald's phone and saw she had recently called an ex, causing Holly to go into a rage, the complaint said. In January 2023, an analysis placed McDonald, Holly, and suspect 2's cell phones together at key locations on the night the 20-year-old was killed, the complaint said. Suspect 2, who died in 2010, was familiar with the area McDonald's body was found, the complaint added. In March 2023, DNA evidence showed Holly had been in McDonald's car, the complaint said. On April 20, 2023, the New York State Police arrested Edward V. Holly, age 42, of Wawayanda, New York, with second-degree murder in connection with the March 2003 murder of Megan McDonald. The news release read, McDonald was discovered deceased in the town of Wallkill, Orange County, on March 15, 2003, from blunt force trauma. Karen Whalen thanked the police for never giving up. For them, it was always a matter of when, not if, this day would come, she said. We have always stood with the police, and we will always stand with them, said Whalen, whose father, Dennis, was a retired NYPD detective. James Whalen, Karen's husband, said, Today, the police gave us an answer that we have been searching for over 20 years. The monster who violently and senselessly took Megan's life now has a name and a face. The person arrested today will never be anything but a coward to our family. In the early morning of April 25, 2010, 911 dispatchers received a frantic call from Heidi Fergus, 25. Someone's trying to break into my home, Heidi Fergus told the dispatcher in audio obtained by ABC News. The call ended abruptly with a loud noise. Just 65 seconds later, another call came in, this time from her husband, Nick Fergus, 27. My wife is shot, somebody broke into our house, Nick Fergus screamed into the phone. I've been shot. Nick Fergus had a gunshot wound to his thigh. Heidi Fergus had been shot in the upper back and was unresponsive. Heidi Fergus died at the scene. In a video interview obtained by 2020, Nick Fergus told police a story of a burglary gone wrong. Nick Fergus said that he awoke to a suspicious noise at his front door, grabbed his shotgun and alerted his sleeping wife. Nick Fergus claimed the gun went off during a life-or-death battle with the burglar and the gun discharged twice, hitting Heidi Fergus, then himself. "I don't remember exactly what happened, but the gun went off. So my fingers slipped down to the trigger went off," Nick Fergus told Sergeant Jim Gray of the St. Paul Police Department. The Fergus house was clean and tidy, and the entryway table beside the front door was undisturbed. Extensive neighborhood canvassing and a K9 search showed no sign of an intruder. He thought he was a black male, but was not entirely sure, Sergeant Jim Gray told ABC News in an interview. Nick Fergus told Gray that the couple was in financial trouble. They were in over $15,000 of credit card debt and losing their home. None of their friends or family knew they were to be evicted the very next day. Investigators found no signs that the couple was packing up for a move. It did not look like anybody was planning to go on a long vacation, let alone moving out of the house, Commander Jake Peterson said in an interview with ABC News. In a review of correspondence between the couple and financial documents found in the home, investigators were unable to find any proof that Heidi Fergus knew of the impending eviction. Finally, Gray asked the big question, "Did you have anything to do with the murder?" "No," Nick Fergus said. "Absolutely not." Nick Fergus retained the services of a defense attorney, Joe Friedberg, who recommended he cease contact with the St. Paul Police Department. At the advice of his lawyer, Nick Fergus declined the SPPD's request to sit down with a police sketch artist to create a composite of the alleged intruder. "I knew they'd use that as a lever to try interrogating him more. So, I said, no, we won't do that, but we'll hire an artist and do it," Friedberg told ABC News. Nick Fergus and Joe Friedberg returned to the SPPD with their own sketch of the alleged intruder, who Nick said was a black male, in his late 30s and wearing a hoodie. The police released the sketch through the media to see if any tips would come in. Years later, a woman identified Michael Pye to police as a potential match. "We started researching him immediately and we started to learn that he was engaged in a pattern of breaking into homes in St. Paul around 6 in the morning, Peterson said. However, Pye was incarcerated on the day of Heidi Fergus' murder. Authorities subsequently cleared him of having any involvement in Heidi's death. A few months after Heidi Fergus' death, Nick Fergus met Rachel Watson. "I definitely felt sorry for him that he had gone through such a trauma," Rachel said in an interview with ABC News. After a year of dating, in August of 2012, Rachel and Nick were married. The couple went on to have 3 children and moved into a house purchased for them by Nick Fergus's parents. Nick and Rachel had an arrangement where they would pay the mortgage amount to Nick's parents and Nick Fergus would pay the property taxes directly to the county. Rachel Fergus found a notice in their home that stated that they were delinquent on their property taxes and that their house was in danger of being foreclosed on. Rachel Fergus said her mind immediately went to Heidi Fergus's death. "I didn't know that this was happening and I'm living with this person. I have children with this person, and the last time he had problems with finances, a lot of things went wrong," she said. Rachel Fergus decided to confront Nick Fergus and recorded the conversations, which have been exclusively obtained by ABC News. In one recording, Rachel Fergus said, "The fact that you're lying was so easy for you to do in front of me over and over and over makes me think that I could murder my wife," he responded. She replied, "Yes." The couple divorced in 2018. In 2019, Sergeant Nicole Sipes of the St. Paul Police Department took a new look at the death of Heidi Fergus. "The case always bothered me because the circumstances didn't seem to fit what happened," Sipes told 2020. Sipes reached out to the FBI to help reconstruct sound data from the 911 call to see if there was evidence of a third person in the house. "There was no noise that we could detect in the background," said FBI agent Pat Riley. The FBI also combined their ballistics testing and a virtual model of Heidi and Nick Fergus' house to prove that the shots were most likely not accidental in the middle of a struggle, but deliberate. However, Nick's attorneys countered that these findings didn't necessarily disprove his version of the events. Once Sipes learned of Nick Fergus' recent divorce from his second wife, she reached out to Rachel Fergus, who shared her suspicions. "She could have also been a victim," Sipes said. In May 2021, Nick Fergus was arrested and charged with second-degree murder in the death of his former wife. A grand jury later indicted him for first-degree murder. Ramsey County prosecutors argued that Nick Fergus hid details of their financial troubles from his wife and murdered her due to the shame of their impending eviction. It wasn't just going to be the loss of this house, it was going to be the realization that he had lied to his wife, and he had lied to his friends, he had lied to the community for many years, Ramsey County Assistant District Attorney Elizabeth Lohman told 2020. Robert Richmond, Nick Fergus' defense attorney, refuted these allegations. In addition to the financial evidence, prosecutors also found only Nick Fergus' DNA on the gun, and several witnesses testified there were no signs of a break-in. Nick Fergus' attorneys claimed the intruder was wearing gloves and only in the home for a couple of seconds, so he couldn't leave DNA evidence. On February 10, after 4 hours of deliberations, the jury found Nick Fergus guilty of murder. He was sentenced Thursday to life in prison without parole. For nearly 45 years, a young woman who was only known as Granby Girl, who had been shot in the head and whose skeletal remains were discovered on a logging road in Granby, Massachusetts, about 15 miles north of Springfield. For years, the unnamed woman was called Granby Girl. Authorities ultimately turned to advanced genetic testing to help them solve the mystery, and they recently identified the murder victim on January 31, was Patricia Tucker, who was 28 and had a 5-year-old son when she was killed without her loved ones knowing for decades, yet her killer still remains unknown. Police have a person of interest in mind, but the man, her late husband, is now deceased. A district attorney's office in Massachusetts announced on March 6 at a Monday press briefing that investigators had established Tucker was the murder victim known to many simply as the Granby Girl, a nickname drawn from the area where she was found. She was 28 years old when her body was found in Granby, a small town near Holyoke, in November 1978. DNA information on Ancestry.com was crucial to the breakthrough, connecting law enforcement with Tucker's surviving family, Northwestern 1st Assistant District Attorney Stephen Gagney explained during a press conference. According to police information cited by the local news outlet MassLive.com, someone shot Tucker in the temple and dragged her by the neck before loggers found her decomposed body buried under leaves and a stump on November 15, 1978. She was later buried in a grave marked unknown, where she remained, even as her case drew interest from amateur sleuths. Meanwhile, Tucker's son, 50-year-old Matthew Dale, told MassLive.com that he grew up in North Carolina without ever being sure why his mom disappeared. He told the outlet that he has assumed since his 30s that she was dead, and he had provided his DNA to a database in case they ever found her. His assumption that his mother was dead started to be confirmed about 2 years ago. A forensic laboratory helped local authorities acquire the Granby Girl's DNA profile, which eventually led them to identify a woman in Maryland who was likely related to her. Police spoke to the woman, who led them to her son, Matthew Dale. Detectives aren't sure who killed Tucker. She was married to a man named Gerald Coleman. The two married in 1977 in Middletown, Connecticut, and lived in East Hampton, Connecticut when she died. Coleman never reported his wife missing, officials said. He is of intense interest to those investigating the death of Tucker, who was also known as Patricia Heckman, Patricia Dale, and Patricia Coleman. But officials were careful to stop short of calling him a murder suspect, and they noted that he died in a Massachusetts state prison in 1996. Dale told police that around the time his mother disappeared, Coleman dropped him off with a woman named Laura Holmes in Chicopee. After several days with no word from Tucker or Coleman, Holmes contacted authorities, and Dale was ultimately reunited with his birth father, Gagne said. Dale never saw his mother or Coleman again. Investigators learned that Coleman had previously been arrested in Connecticut in 1968 for attempted kidnapping, aggravated assault, and carrying a firearm. In 1995, he was convicted in Hampton County Superior Court of rape, indecent assault and battery, and assault with a dangerous weapon. He died in state prison in 1996. Gerald Coleman, although deceased, is certainly at a minimum a person of strong interest in Patricia's disappearance and death, Gagne said. The murder investigation remains active, he said, adding that officials are looking to speak with anyone who knew Tucker at any point in her life, but especially during her marriage to Coleman. Anyone with information can call the Granby Police Department at 413-467-9222, email Detective James White at white@granbip.org, or submit a message through the department's website. What do you guys think? Do you think her husband, Gerald Coleman, did it? Let me know in the comments down below. A former education executive was sentenced Monday, January 29 in Connecticut to 40 to 72 years in prison on kidnapping charges connected to a series of 1984 home invasion attacks on 4 women who say they were sexually assaulted by him. 18 years for each victim, with 40 years mandatory. The crimes were solved in 2020 with the help of a genealogy database, as well as a DNA sample originally taken from the man's trash, which matched samples found at the crime scenes. Michael Sharp, 71, a former leader of a charter school organization, apologized to the women during the hearing in Hartford Superior Court, after saying he has memory problems and had no recollection of the crimes, the Hartford Courant reported. "I don't know what happened. I don't know, but I'm so sorry. You deserve so much better. No one should ever come into your home and violate you. If I was this person, if I was this monster, I hope he is dead inside that 2 months of my life." 3 of the women were in the courtroom and cried during his comments, while the 4th took part via video conference. All 4 testified about being attacked in their bedrooms in the middle of the night and how they suffered lifelong trauma. Sharp broke into the women's homes in Bloomfield, Middletown, Windsor and Rocky Hill after the attacks. Each woman noticed money or valuables had been stolen, while some women testified during the 5-day trial that their phones had been disabled or food had been eaten. One victim said Sharp kissed her on the forehead after the assault and said, "Thanks for being such a good sport." Each of the victims, who were identified only by their first names, spoke during the sentencing hearing and described how the assaults have darkened their lives. Linda said Sharp should be in prison for 38 years, so he can suffer in a cell for the same time that she has had to endure. For years, she lost sleep in fear that her attacker would return, she said. She also suffered a great sense of shame, Linda said, and was too scared to get into a relationship with a man. Roseanne, who spoke remotely by video feed, said she was afraid to be alone for years. Sharp showed no sign of remorse, she said, going on to attack more victims after he assaulted the first woman in her. She called for the harshest sentence possible. Kathleen recalled how she had just moved to Connecticut from New York to start a new job. Her world was full of promise when Sharp attacked her and tore her life to pieces, she said. She moved, bought 2 dogs, took firearms lessons and purchased a gun, but remained terrified. She married a man she didn't love, Kathleen said, because she didn't want to be alone. Before the attack, she thought she was a strong person and would be able to defend herself, but she froze when Sharp appeared at her bedside. She met her current husband in 1989 and life has gotten better, Kathleen said. Sharp tried to take her soul, she said, but did not succeed. Shelley said Sharp made her live in fear, both for herself and her daughter, who was 3 years old and in the bedroom with her when he crept into her house. Her daughter was in hospice and died of cancer during the trial, Shelley said. She, ultimately, was one of his victims, too, Shelley said. Her life will never be whole and she will never know the person she might have been, she said. Shelley also called for the maximum prison term. Relatives of Sharp also testified and asked Judge Frank Didabo for leniency. Police at the time of the assaults interviewed people connected with the women hoping to find a common thread. Despite similarities in the cases, however, it wasn't until 2003 when investigators could use new technology to establish an official link. Scientists at the state's forensic lab found semen samples on items from the 4 incidents: a bath towel, a washcloth, and 2 sets of sheets. Each contained DNA from the same person. However, the case stalled again because investigators were not able to link the DNA to a specific person. But in 2020, investigators received leads from an out-of-state agency not affiliated with law enforcement that suggested potential matches. Police first eliminated Sharp's brother and his 2 half-brothers after testing additional DNA samples from the relatives. Police then pursued a lead on Sharp by testing items collected from his trash and found he matched the case's DNA profile. A swab test conducted with a search warrant confirmed the match, authorities said. Sharp was arrested on November 17, 2020. He was later released from custody on a promise to appear in court, according to judicial records. In the 5-day trial in October, prosecutors put 22 witnesses on the stand and presented more than 100 exhibits. One forensic analyst testified the chance of the DNA profile matching another person would be 1 in 7 billion. The jury returned with guilty verdicts after only a half-hour of deliberation. Sharp spoke before the sentencing Monday and said he has had memory problems and does not remember long periods of time, but he said, "I don't know how I could have done something so monstrous." He wanted a jury of his peers to decide whether I was this monster, Sharp said, choking up, and they said I was. He then stood and addressed the victims, saying, "I don't know what happened. I don't know, but I'm so sorry. If I was this monster, I hope he's dead inside that 2 months of my life," Sharp said. His daughter, Michelle Thomas, also spoke, saying the man the victims described is not my father. She described Sharp as kind and generous and said she hoped to prove one day that he is not guilty. Sharp's brother, George Sharp, addressed the court and said, "My brother's a good person. Mike, I love you," he said to his brother. Defense attorney Dana Sinetti said Sharp has multiple health issues, and I don't think an argument can be made that the public needs to be kept safe from Mr. Sharp. But Didabo said Sharp had lived and enjoyed life while his victims suffered for almost 4 decades. Bridgeport hired Sharp's charter school company, Family Urban Schools of Excellence, to run Dunbar School in 2013. At the time, Sharp was well known and respected in Hartford, where his organization ran Jumoke Academy. Officials later discovered Sharp had lied about having a doctorate and did not disclose a past felony conviction, prompting them to fire the company. Sharp also lied about the criminal backgrounds of some of his employees who worked as school aides. He pleaded guilty in 1985 in Hartford to 2 counts of third-degree forgery and, 4 years later, served prison time after pleading guilty to embezzlement in Oakland, California. Those who have suffered from sexual abuse or violence can speak to specialists for support, information, advice, or referral by calling the free and confidential National Sexual Assault Hotline at 800-656-HOPE-4673. Those who wish to chat online with trained specialists, which is also free and confidential, can also go to www.rain.org/get-help. Help is available 24/7. A Pittsburgh woman who went missing more than 30 years ago in a case that stumped authorities who later declared her legally dead has been found living in a nursing home in Puerto Rico. Patricia Coptis left behind a husband and siblings and meandered through northern Puerto Rico for a while before she was taken as a person in need to the adult care home in 1999, according to details announced at a news conference this week in Ross Township, where she once lived. Coptis, once known as a street preacher in her hometown, initially kept her past secret while in Puerto Rico. But she began to divulge details as she suffered progressively from dementia, Ross Township Deputy Police Chief Brian Colehep said. Colehep said those who knew her in Puerto Rico finally made the connection and contacted Ross Township Police, CBS Pittsburgh reported. As she asked and spoke more, she leaked enough details about her identity that they were able to connect enough dots to contact us, Colehep said. Last year, a social worker at the home alerted authorities back home about the now 83-year-old woman. A DNA test has confirmed her identity, Colehep said. Her husband, Bob Coptis, and her surviving sister, 78-year-old Gloria Smith, filled in details of Coptis' life at the news conference and in telephone interviews Friday with the Associated Press. Shock. I didn't believe it. Total shock, Gloria Smith said of learning the news. Patricia Coptis had been nicknamed the Sparrow because of her slight build and often frequented parking lots and busy roads in the largely residential community of about 31,000 north of Pittsburgh, where she would caution passers-by and motorists about the end of the world. Her family said she suffered from mental health issues and feared being institutionalized, CBS Pittsburgh reported. She would always hang out down in Pittsburgh where things were going on. When there was a baseball game going on, when a concert was going on, she would be talking to people, Bob Coptis said about his wife. But before she began preaching, Coptis was a straight-A student who became a model and dance instructor. After graduating high school, she worked in finance at a Pittsburgh plate glass company and would attend ballroom dancing events weekly, according to her family. She would vacation often in Puerto Rico with her friends before she got married, Smith recalled. She just loved the ocean, the beach, the warm sunshine, Smith told the AP. Smith said her sister quit her job at the glass company after 10 years because of migraines that doctors blamed on stress. She then got a job as an elevator operator at the Art Institute of Pittsburgh. That's when family members noticed a change in her. She said something about seeing an angel there, Smith recalled. Shortly afterward, Coptis began preaching and was briefly institutionalized after doctors diagnosed her with delusions of grandeur and said she had signs of schizophrenia. Upon her release, she kept preaching until she vanished in 1992. I come home one night, and she's just gone, Bob Coptis told the AP. They had been married for 20 years. Coptis, now 86, recalled how they met near a river in Pittsburgh where he had a boat. He gave her and her friends a ride and fell in love. In 1972, they married. The disappearance stumped authorities and family alike. Police went as far as to consult a psychic, while Coptis recalled his wife once mentioned she would like to go to Puerto Rico because of its balmy weather. So he published ads in Puerto Rican newspapers, but never got a response. Years went by with no sign of her. He obtained a death declaration about 7 years after her disappearance. I went through a lot, said Bob Coptis, a retired truck driver. Every time they'd find a body somewhere, I wondered, is it Patricia? Is it Patricia? Meanwhile, Patricia Coptis apparently was wandering the island's northern towns of Naranjito, Corozal and Toa Alta, located just southwest of the capital of San Juan. When she first was taken in at the adult home, she had hinted that she had arrived in Puerto Rico via a cruise ship from Europe, Colehep said. After a social worker contacted police in Pennsylvania, it took almost a year for DNA samples to confirm that the woman was indeed Patricia Coptis. It's a sad thing, but it's a relief off my mind, her husband said. When your wife goes missing, you're a suspect. Bob Coptis, who did not remarry, said he doesn't plan to visit, and that he's now trying to forget the past, though he's glad to know she's being taken care of. She could have come home at any time. She always said she wanted to go to a warm climate, he said. Smith, on the other hand, wants to go to the island to see her older sister. She says she's been unable to speak to the elder sibling on the phone because she cannot hold a conversation, given her dementia. A twin sister of Patricia Coptis died without knowing her fellow twin was still alive. Whether she knows me or not, I still want to see her and give her a hug and tell her I love her, Smith said. I thought maybe she had died. If you like the video, show your support and like, subscribe and make sure you click on the bell icon to stay tuned.